This conference will now be recorded.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the Family Legacy Council's 5th webinar in our ongoing series. We've so far had a chance to, in the first webinar, cover the shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve phenomenon. And in the second, we covered the 6-step process to healthy family governance. In the third, we covered the Family Advancement Sustainability Trust that Marvin Blum presented to us all. The fourth was family meetings are not one and done. You've got to keep going. This is an ongoing lifelong learning process. And today, our fifth, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Jonathan Green with us from the O'Connor Group, the O'Connor Professional Group in Boston, to speak to us about disruptions and what to do about them. The O'Connor Group is certainly a large, if not the largest, one of the best, if not the best, possibly the most expensive, but worth every penny of it. Professional group that swoops in with a SWAT team to help families when these disruptions happen. And John is in charge of that practice for them. So John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure, no, glad to be with you. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you all. Great description of the O'Connor Professional Group, or as I'll call it for everyone's sake, OPG, going forward for the rest of the time we're together today. Yes, we are exactly that. We are the largest. I'd like to think we're the best, and I won't comment on whether and to what degree we're the most expensive. But certainly I would say the focus today is less on what can OPG do, but more what has our experience and our set of experiences across 15 to 20 full-time folks and about 150 part-time providers all across the nation. What have we learned about disruptions when families try to navigate these waters and encounter issues like addiction, mental health, eating disorders, and certainly autism spectrum disorders? I will throughout this, Tom, certainly you and I know each other, so by all means, if at any point there's something I'm saying that seems like there's a natural question coming up for you, by all means, feel free to jump in. This is by no means a beginning to end presentation. It's more of a conversation than anything else. So I think I'd like to start by defining the problem a little bit for everybody. There may be some lore that folks have heard, but more importantly, there's data to back it up and research to back it up that affluent families are at higher risk for a number of mental health problems. Certainly you can see on the slide there which and for what reasons. Additionally, I think what's important to point out is that ADD and ADHD are things that are more common among affluent families. Jim Grubman, who's a psychologist that's been working with families with considerable resources and is a wealth psychologist, very well known in the field, had a paper come out, I believe within the past 5 to 10 years, that documented this phenomenon and talked more and more about, especially in G2 and younger generations, that ADD and ADHD were more likely to show up. From where I sit, I think that's additionally relevant because earlier onsets of ADD and ADHD can be indicators and risk factors for things like substance use. So with that being the case, we certainly want to be in the best position possible to help families identify those diagnoses early on and make sure that there's appropriate treatment as soon as that can be put in place. The other phenomena that are important to keep in mind is that beyond these diagnoses potentially being more prevalent, there are a number of factors that can help to make them worse, have a higher impact. So there's an important phenomenon here that is rarely discussed, I'd say, outside of the fields of psychology and social work and mental health broadly. We often with disorders get hung up in what is the diagnosis and what are the symptoms. So depression means feeling sad generally. There's more to it. There's weight loss. There's things like that. Anxiety means being fearful of something. PTSD is accompanied by nightmares. But what's really important is that to have a diagnosis, you not only need to have those symptoms, but it needs to impact what's called your psychosocial functioning. It needs to affect the way that you go on in your life and sort of carry on. It impacts whether or not you can work, whether or not you can go to school, whether or not you can interact with family members. One of the challenges that shows up for families with considerable resources is that sometimes there aren't the same pressures to engage in that psychosocial functioning. So something we see very often, a failure to launch phenomenon. Somebody could be struggling with substance use, with anxiety disorders and things of that nature. But there's enough resources there that they're not sort of in a position where they have to work, or they have to generate their own resources. And so these disorders can continue on for a period of time without treatment, making them worse and worse. Any mental health disorder, the longer it goes untreated and undiagnosed, the more intractable it's likely to become. So I'd say to that end, it can be more challenging for families in these positions, even though they have access to far greater resources. It can make it more challenging for these kinds of diagnoses to create issues that can't be resolved with those resources, or sort of covered up is the way we tend to think about it. I'll go on from there. I think there's a few ways that I want to try and think about things today, from how families, advisors, sort of anyone involved can be thinking about what to do with these disruptions. Certainly understanding and identifying the problem is important. But I'd say beyond that, before we talk about things like what to do when one needs to swoop in with a SWAT team, as it were, a behavioral health SWAT team, which is how I'll be referring to us going forwards. What is it that a family or advisors can do in advance to try and help prevent these systems and sort of make them harder targets for these sorts of issues? Certainly one that I encourage families to do when I'm meeting with them is to have conversations early on about what are some of the issues that have shown up for this family in the past. Sometimes this can mean being as specific as having a consultant come in and do a genogram with families to look and see where have mental health problems arisen in the past. So both mental health and substance use problems. In what family members and what branches of the family? How do these things seem to be traveling from one generation to the next? And then identifying for families, what are the things that the living generations, the generations that are alive now, what might they have to deal with in their lifetime? What issues may arise in some of the living family members? And really coming to an understanding ahead of time, all together, how can we prepare ourselves for this? What will be our warning signs that we need to intervene with one of our family members when they start to struggle? How will we have that conversation? What words will we use so that we're being helpful and not pejorative? How will we build this into our governance and ensuring that resources are allocated to help someone get better, but not being allocated towards, at the very worst, helping someone to stay sick or enabling them, allowing them to continue using substances or behave in ways that don't further their mental health, but further their mental unhealth. Those can be really important to have, especially early on. Certainly related to that, if families have a history of substance use problem, having conversations with younger generations around what recovery is and what it looks like, what normal and abnormal substance use looks like, what's normal drinking, what's abnormal drinking, how will we know when we're having a problem? And if we do, how do we create avenues where folks can seek help without there being shame involved? Oftentimes that process too, I think, can mean identifying providers that family members trust. Waiting until there is a crisis, certainly you could have somebody like our group come in and swoop in and be helpful, but it's far better if there's already an established set of relationships with a family psychiatrist or a primary care physician, someone that's knowledgeable, someone that knows people as they're developing and growing and sort of already understands who they are and isn't necessarily meeting them in the middle of a crisis. It's always so helpful for those providers to have a baseline to understand, here's how, Jimmy, who's in generation 3, I've known him since he was 8 years old, and I have a general sense of who he is. I know what he was like growing up. I know what his times were like in high school. Now he's struggling in adulthood. I know what he looks like when he's doing well. The way he's behaving now is more problematic. There's been a shift. Always easier to do that way. I also think it's really important to, and this is the point at the bottom of the slide, think through things like healthcare proxies and maybe more importantly, releases so that parents and providers can communicate with each other appropriately. For those who haven't run into it, HIPAA laws, which are basically healthcare information laws, say that as soon as someone turns 18, their healthcare information is their own, unless they have a release in place specifically. So this is often challenging for parents when they have their children go off to college and their kids' grades are their own and their kids' healthcare information is their own. They don't know if there's a problem, if they're seeing a therapist, if they're seeing a psychiatrist, if they're seeing a physician, though they may get the bills in the mail. I think it's really important to have conversations between adults and certainly adult children around if we're going to be providing support, we need to have some understanding of what's going on with you. That doesn't mean, I think sometimes folks can learn to see a release as a total yes, no. You have complete access to my information or not. In fact, there's a lot of nuance that's involved, and there's a lot of conversations to be had with, I'd say, adult children as they go off to college in particular. Releases are quite nuanced, and we can ask for things just like, are you going to meetings at all? Can I have information about that? I don't need to know the content. I don't need to know anything specific. I don't need to know what medications you're on or not. We can sort of find a middle ground where I have enough as maybe a parent or someone that's involved in your life to know that you're getting the right care without knowing every detail, because certainly that's not going to lead to effective therapy or effective help for somebody. Moving on from there, I think it's important also to try and figure out what are some of the clues that there are issues that are showing up in a family and that we are seeing problems. And I mean problems before we know for a fact that somebody is really hit a crisis point. Oftentimes, I get called, and certainly my group gets called when a major issue arises. Someone comes home and they've had a DUI, a car has been wrecked, they've truly had a psychotic break and they've been hospitalized. And oftentimes we're able to work with families and try and figure out what may have happened before this. What things have families been either afraid to or unwilling to try and address, because it's challenging. Addressing these issues can be very difficult. Certainly things like if we start to see things that impact that first thing I was talking about, that psychosocial functioning. So things like being absent from events, not showing up to work, not showing up to a job, even family events as well. Certainly mental health problems, especially issues with addiction, come with a certain degree of secretiveness to them. There's a common saying, it's an older saying, that these things grow in the dark. And that's definitely true of addictions and any sort of anxiety-based disorder. There's a lot of impetus to try and isolate and hide. Sometimes because of shame, but usually because there's some understanding from the person suffering that the folks around them may see what's going on for them. And they may prefer that not be the case. They may feel sort of okay with the particular kind of discomfort they're currently experiencing. Overspending is something that certainly we see quite often, especially with affluent families. And certainly governance can play into this in the way certain trusts are laid out. Overspending is another kind of addiction. We would consider that a process addiction. So there's really two kinds of addiction. One is a chemical addiction that we're all very familiar with. That's adding any sort of chemicals to your body to the point where your body has some form of dependence on them. Certainly we hear about alcohol and opiates are very common, prescription medications as well. This other phenomenon of process addictions, there's no addition of a chemical per se, but it's a certain set of behaviors that one might become addicted to. Certainly overspending is one that we see quite often. Another one, especially in young men, is pornography, sex addictions as well. And more common, I'd say, among teenagers in particular, are video games. That's particularly challenging. Can't tell you how many times I've had parents ask me about how to solve the problem of Fortnite. And if you have children at that age, you're very familiar with what Fortnite is. It's a video game that's very popular. There was recently I believe it was a World Series or a Super Bowl of Fortnite where someone won, some 16-year-old man, young boy won $3 million. I mean, it's quite the phenomenon. And parents really struggle with that. We can certainly consider that part of a process addiction. And if kids don't learn boundaries early enough around that, it can bleed over into other issues in their lives. And so there's certainly a lot of coaching to be done there. Other things that may pop up that let us know there's a problem going on more broadly. Legal issues, oftentimes I will say we get called after someone gets in trouble with the law, and we're showing up in court to help describe either to the judge or VA, why these particular issues have arisen. They're part of a mental health problem, medical problems, issues with school. Certainly we see things where folks can suddenly become interested in weapons or unusual kinds of beliefs. I think the unusual beliefs is particularly important. Something we see as often as not is a presence of what are called psychotic disorders, especially because of the ages of folks we tend to interact with. Psychotic disorder is kind of a big picture term for any disorder where somebody loses touch with reality. Anything that begins with schiz, really. So schizophrenia is one, certainly people hear of, but other terms you might hear are schizophreniform, schizoid, schizotypal, delusional disorders. It's really any combination of some issues with mood, not being in touch with reality, so having delusions like people are out to get me, or a movie star is in love with me, or maybe that there's special messages from the TV or the radio that are just for me. And there are critical ages for this. I'd say, when right around from the age when folks first start going to college, maybe a little later, like their 20s, into their 30s or 40s. So it's something to be aware of as we're thinking about things that can go wrong and disruptions in the family. That critical period is important to keep an eye out for these things, especially if families have had a history of things like this. So people having delusional disorder, schizophrenia, even things like a bipolar disorder can in later generations manifest as something like a schizophrenia, one of these delusional disorders or psychotic disorders. And then the last, I think, is a really important phenomenon. It's certainly one we see quite a bit in families where there's a failure to launch issue, where someone isn't able to go from being supported by their family to developing some sort of independence, some sort of ability to function on their own. There can be a real challenge or difficulties when there are challenges presented, having to find a job, having to try and move out on one's own, even smaller things like being asked to help out around the home. There can be an overreaction to that. The typical understanding of this is usually that folks who are in this failure to launch category, they've gone much of their lives not really having to challenge themselves and not really having to learn what they can or can't do. So I'm going to sound like a real therapist for a minute, and I apologize. Sigmund Freud, who is not one of my favorites, but he was asked once, what is the one thing you need to be happy and successful? And he basically said, there are two. I can't come up with one, but there are two. And the two are love and work. Now, love is an easy one. We have a sense of what that looks like from your family, from a romantic partner. But really, it's a sense of belonging and being a member of the community. The other part, work, though, doesn't necessarily mean work either. It's not going somewhere, punching a clock, and getting a paycheck. It's having a purpose or meaning in the world, whether that's volunteering, being a parent, whatever the story is. If you think about it, folks who are in this failure to launch category, who haven't had to find any kind of independence on their own, they've never really had an opportunity to develop that work thing, that sense of purpose. That can, over time, create this really difficult set of emotions where someone is never really sure what they're capable of. If everything went south tomorrow, do they have any opportunities to sort of provide for themselves and sort of keep their head above water? Most of these folks, maybe initially this overreaction that we're seeing can be in anger and frustration. But if you spend some time getting to know folks in this scenario, they're usually terrified. They're usually quite afraid. And that's where that anger and that overreactivity comes from. Same thing with the lack of coping skills. If somebody's never been pushed to learn a lot of these things, they may not have the skills to adapt. I often use the term with families when they're struggling with situations like this, the gift of desperation. And I think most people can think about times in their life when they really grew and changed, some real pivotal moments. They were typically some pretty desperate moments where it was make or break. One thing that can happen for families in this situation is they may end up robbing their loved one of the gift of desperation and really being able to define themselves. That's when we develop our coping skills, and in the absence of those, people can show up without them. So to that end, I just wanted to speak a little bit about differences between folks we see that are able to launch successfully and folks that get stuck. There's some great reading to this end that I found particularly useful. If folks haven't read it, I can't remember exactly the author's name, Covey, and I know she works at Ballantine Partners, a book called Raised Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise. And the book goes along and takes a very different perspective than I'd say a lot of other books on parenting children. Usually those books will interview parents and talk about what went wrong or what are the challenges, and it really operates from a deficit model. What are the problems and how do we solve them? This book really turns that on its head and interviews kids that came from parents with resources, and now they're all adult children. But they're asked to recount, these kids that have done quite well and have been successful. What did you learn growing up? What are the things that stuck with you? What were the lessons that you got from your parents? And how did you get to be the point where you were able to make your wealth and your resources work for you and still find some version of independence while also being very closely connected to your family? These were often folks that some of the lessons that they were calling are, early opportunities to earn and manage their own money. Sometimes earn means an allowance by doing chores early on and having an understanding that they could spend a lot of that money very quickly if they wanted to, and then learning, if I spend all that money, I don't have money left over. I spent it on this, crazy thing, sea monkeys or something like that, and they all died when I was 8 years old. And now I have to remember, I should probably investigate when I'm going to spend a lot of my money. They do have personal goals. They do have some sense of their own independence from the family. But I think there's also this key point, and Tom, I know you and I have talked about this, that it's not independence for independence sake. There's an ability to have my own identity and personality, but also I need to remain, tied to my family and understand that there are relationships here that are incredibly valuable. So it's not a blind and sort of just for the sake of independence that shows up here. And certainly also these are folks, because they had that gift of desperation, those opportunities to struggle in their life, they can overcome setbacks. They've had that happen before. They've had those make or break moments. Certainly, I'd say the opposite there on the right-hand side of the screen. That's something that our group has encountered several times, or say more than several, quite often. It's very interesting how sort of that entitlement, that difficulty moving forward in life can be very closely tied to mental health problems. Which begets which, I'm not sure. I could imagine that the reason the two run together is that to overcome a lot of the challenges we have in life, anxiety, depression, whatever the story might be, we need to have ways of adapting with what life throws at us. If we've not had opportunities to develop coping skills, we're stuck. There's sort of this old lore around substance use disorders in particular, that the age at which one sort of gets stuck developmentally, quote unquote, is the age at which they first started using substances in a problematic way. Some of that to me adds up. One could imagine that you can imagine a young man that starts drinking heavily at 18 years old, and he's now in his 40s. Over the course of those, call it 20 or so years, a little more, the only coping strategy that person has likely had that they've turned to over and over is drinking. Something bad happens, they drink. Someone breaks up with them, they drink. They have a tough day at work, they drink. They have a good day at work, they drink. What's interesting is that's the one thing they've turned to over and over. There's not been opportunities to diversify. They've not also learned to exercise when they're stressed, or reach out to people and call for help, or chat with friends, or watch a sports game, or whatever the story is. They've continued to just look to alcohol for a solution. So in the meantime, that person looks much like an 18-year-old because they've not had to develop those other skills in life. That's a pretty tough situation to be in, especially when folks say this, gentleman we're talking about maybe hits his 40s. He decides he wants to be sober. Sobriety at that point is only part of the problem. The big part is that there's 20 some odd years of emotional development to be done. And that's why, if you know much about AA and those sorts of self-help programs, very little of it is about drinking. Most of it is about development as a person. So that's usually how I end up conceptualizing things like entitlement. It has more to do with development as a human being, and far less, to do with the presenting issues that we might see and the frustrations we might encounter with folks like that. So I would say a challenge that shows up often for family members, for advisors, and everybody in between is this idea of, okay, John, so you're telling me that there's these things that might be going on in a family unit. I might have some awareness of them, and maybe as you're talking about them, I'm becoming more aware. But how do I step into this thing? How do I start to label what's going on and not have it implode, not have my family members lose their cool with me? If I'm an advisor, something to the effect of not losing assets under management, or not overstepping the boundary and sort of blowing up the rapport I've built over a number of years, maybe even decades. I really don't know how to do this. I'd say, first things first, great. If you're having those reactions, that means you understand the sensitive nature of all of this, which is good. That'll serve you well. I'm usually far more worried about folks that charge in and aren't as thoughtful about these things. So then the question is how to have these conversations, how to start them. I think on this slide, there's certainly a lot of specific language. I'm less concerned about the specific language and more about the general theme that shows up. If you look at each one of these sentences, you'll see I or me or my somewhere at the very beginning of them. And that's not an accident. There's a great thing that happens when I take some ownership in what it is I'm saying. So this is what therapists do all the time, if you ever watch us. Good therapists anyway. I can't speak for everybody in my guild. But if I am to say, to somebody, you have a problem, you're drinking, you're depressed, you need to get out of the house, whatever it is, you can almost hear in your mind as I'm saying that the automatic defensive response. No, I don't. Go away. Leave me alone. I'm going to do what I want, et cetera, et cetera. Because as soon as we sort of point and say you and label something, we already get that defensiveness that shows up. The way in is to talk about it from your own perspective. There's these great statements, maybe if you've been to therapy, and certainly if you've ever done any couples therapy, I use it a lot with couples I work with, of I feel statements, right? I feel X when you Y, so I'm going to request that you Z. I feel frustrated when you don't take out the trash after I've told you 10 times. I'm going to ask that maybe you do it the first time. And the important part is frustrated or sad or disappointed, whatever that softer emotion is. So I might say to a family to try and own, my part of things. I'll use an example. Family I'm working with where somebody has decided that they're going to get engaged. And I think the entire family is quite concerned about this person they're getting engaged with, and there are red flags everywhere, and no one's quite sure how to say it. I might say, we'll call this guy Mark, and say, hey, Mark, heard about your engagement. Congratulations, all great news. I got to share with you, I've been thinking about it since we last talked. It's really been on my mind. I'm sort of unsettled. There's a lot of things from my perspective, from a 30,000-foot view, that make me concerned about this relationship overall. Could we maybe talk through some of those? Because I want to be happy for you and I want to be excited, and I just can't get this out of my mind. I feel like I got to air some of these things out. Can we work through what they are? Can we talk about, how you met this person a couple months ago and they were dating someone at the time, and what does that mean for you that they did that? Because I think about that, and I just I think about my training and what I went through and what I know about couples and things, and that doesn't seem like a good setup to start an engagement or a marriage. You'll notice almost all of what I just did was I, me, my, through and through.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah. Well, I went to school for a few years, so it should be easier for me. Certainly, it's not something that one becomes expert at overnight, but that's the tool to rely on, is how do I do the me part? How do I bring in my emotions and my soft emotions, worry, concern, fear, things like that. Rarely anger or frustration. Those are secondary emotions. They're tough, they're hard, they elicit defensiveness. How do I bring that concern to the forefront? I would also say to this end, if ever folks have an opportunity to learn something called motivational interviewing, I'll say it again, motivational interviewing, or MI for short. It is a way of interacting with someone. It's not a therapy per se. It's probably the closest thing I have to a Jedi mind trick in my bag. It was developed initially in, I believe it was the 1980s, for folks that were struggling with substances in particular. So it used to be the case that substance use treatment was somebody would be, drinking or whatever the story is, and somebody, a therapist or some helping person, would yell at them and say, why are you drinking? You don't care about your family. You're spending money that should be putting food on your table. You don't care about your kids. And of course, what does the person do? They shout back, no, the hell with you. I'm going to do what I want. You didn't understand me. And we just sort of argue back and forth. Motivational interviewing turns that entire process on its head. So I might sit down with somebody if I'm taking a motivational interviewing approach and say, I'm glad we're able to sit together. I think I really understand you after listening and hearing you talk about your drinking. I get the sense that maybe what other people don't understand about you is that your drinking is more important than anything else in your life. It's more important than your wife, your kids, and more important than putting food on your table. Like, I think we need to have a conversation about, the way in which your life is organized around this, and that's really of critical importance to you. And nobody in their right mind is going to say, you're right, drinking is the most important thing. They'll say, no, you don't understand at all. My wife is the most important thing. My kids are the most important thing. Why would you think drinking is the most important thing? And then I sit back and say, that's interesting. I've never heard you say it that way before. If I were to look at your life, it looks like drinking is the most important thing. Help me understand. How is it that your wife and your kids are most important? Let's talk this through. What's important about that is they've already told me in their words, right? Their mouth has moved and said, my kids are more important. My wife is more important. We're already often moving towards change at that point. So you can imagine the stuck client you have with whatever behavior or issue you're seeing a family member. If you had the opportunity to say things in that way and hear them articulate the other side of the argument, even for a little bit, how different is that from the kinds of interactions we usually have? Usually I talk with folks, and it seems to be the case that at many points in our life, with family, with friends, with whatever it is, if we've had a disagreement, it's almost like we're both reading from a script. I'll say my part, and then you'll disagree with me, and then I'll disagree with you, and we'll have the same discussion we've had many, many times. The nice thing about this motivational interviewing approach is that it flips the script. And suddenly someone has to argue the other side. So it's the old Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season, rabbit season, duck season. It can tend to work that way, and it's kind of fun when it happens. The other piece I'll say here while on this slide about how to approach the subject, one of the most important things you can do, and I'll actually think through it as we switch to the next slide, one of the most important things you can do in this whole process of trying to articulate things and help people to create any kind of change and enter these conversations is make sure that the person you're talking to actually feels heard. So there's a great book. It's a psychology classic called On Persuasion and Healing. It's Jerome, and I can't remember his last name. But I'll summarize the book and save you 300-something pages. The short version is, if you want someone to change or to hear your version of change, or really anything it is you have to offer them, they first have to hear like you've heard their side and understand it. And I think this is critically important if you're dealing with anybody that you're trying to create some sort of change with or have an entry conversation with. You find that they're saying the same thing over and over and over and over to you, even though you've articulated that you've heard them and you think you clearly understand what's going on. It's a good indicator that they haven't figured that out yet. For whatever reason, there's something about the way you're communicating back to them that you've heard them that isn't working. So what's usually useful there is to try and clarify that for someone, or what I say is sort of comment on the process of what's going on. And simply say, it feels like we've had this conversation many, many times. I think I understand what you're saying. I think it means this, but I hear you keep saying it over and over. What am I missing? What is there that you don't think I'm hearing or understanding? That can often be the thing that moves the conversation along. It allows folks an opportunity to try and explain very clearly, here's the issue I'm having. And then you get to repeat it back to them and say, oh, I do clearly understand. Now let's move on to the piece where we talk about change. Other key points that you can see from the subsequent slide, and not in this particular order, just certain guidelines for having these kinds of communications. Being brief is important, being specific. So not, oh, you've told me about these issues in the past. It's, you told me last month that your son is drinking and you're worried that he's going to kill himself. Or, you told me over the past, 3 quarters that we've checked in that you're worried about your daughter at school because you're seeing things on social media that make it look like she's not safe. That's more effective. Being positive, what I mean by that is more the phenomenon of coming alongside someone to help them solve it together. It's some of that self-disclosure or, that taking partial responsibility thing that's down the bottom. I heard that, I'm concerned, I'm worried for you, I'm having a hard time with it too. What can we sort of do here? How can we think about it? In that you're labeling your feelings, you're offering some understanding, and certainly offering to help in any way you can. That can take a number of different forms, everything from, is there a phone call or something you'd like me to make, or there's resources I have access to that may be of use, professionals or whatever the story is. But concluding with that can be useful. And sometimes if I feel like somebody's not ready for me to offer them help, I'll say to them, or it doesn't seem like they're ready to change or any of these things, I'll often ask a how will we know question. So right now, isn't the time to get help, or right now isn't the time to change. How will we know when it is? How bad should things be? What red flags would we be looking for? And that conversation usually goes one of 2 ways. One, we find out that all those red flags already exist and we should really be making this change now. Or we really do a nice job of setting things up for the next time we interact to know that we have criteria for when we need to intervene. I think it's also important to point out there are going to be times where even once a family has decided that they want to try and intervene and make a change or address some sort of an issue that's showing up, there's a lot of places where they do get stuck. Simply said, systems detest change. Family systems, businesses, hospitals, volunteer organizations, they usually run one way, and to have them run a different way takes quite an effort. Perhaps families in particular, because they've often been functioning a certain way for a very long period of time. And there's a high degree of interaction between a lot of families. Even though we may be talking with someone who's particularly willing to entertain change, that doesn't mean that all family members are necessarily going to go along with that. Using some of those skills that we talked about, identifying with folks, being positive and brief, some of those motivational interviewing statements and I feel statements can help to work with families in that way. I do think it's also helpful to work with a coalition of the willing whenever we can in a family. That's often the best way to affect change. We may not be able to work with the folks that are really quite stuck. One thing that shows up in my role often is there may be one parent who identifies a problem in a family, maybe with an adult child. We can sort of work with them to bring another parent on board. But it may be the case that we never get access to the person that's actually suffering, the person who's using substances or mentally ill or spending too much or whatever the story is. And that's not always the end of the world. Usually that means our work is then in coaching the family and the parents how to set and maintain boundaries. What are we willing to support and what are we not willing to support? There's this overall treatment model that's used primarily in substance use, but it can be used for a number of different disorders that are problematic. The CRAFT model, C-R-A-F-T, and I apologize, I'm not going to remember the full acronym, but I know the FT stands for family therapy. It's 2 very simple principles that go on in CRAFT. One is, and this is usually coaching for families, not for individuals, we're helping families to understand that one, if somebody is in recovery or doing healthy behaviors or sober or not overspending or whatever that thing is, we're going to show up and we're going to support them. And we're going to give them love and affection and reinforcers and things like that. if somebody is in the middle of their addiction or overspending or mental health problems and they're not seeking treatment as we know they should be, that's when we're going to hold boundaries. That's when there might be financial leverage that we use. That might be times where we say, if they call us, we'll get on the phone and say, I'm happy to hear from you, but until the next words out of your mouth are, I'm ready to seek help, I really can't have a conversation with you. Important to highlight those things because often families naturally work the opposite way. Usually it's when somebody's not doing well and struggling, that's when families show up with resources. And can we help pay for their apartment for a period of time, or give them money to tide them over until they have a job, or can we bail them out of jail, show up at a bar and rescue them, or have our security liaison rescue them, whatever it is, that's where a lot of the resources show up. And then when people are doing well, we tend to disappear, right? We don't show up with the same level of resources. In fact, what families are subtly doing is reinforcing that addictive behavior or poor mental health behavior, whatever that negative functioning is. So it can be quite challenging for families to do the opposite of what feels natural. And it makes sense. I think if you think about if a family member is physically ill and they're in the hospital, that's when we tend to show up a lot of resources. And there's no problem with that. We're not reinforcing somebody having cardiac issue or cancer or something like that. But the game does change when we get to mental health problems, and we need to take the opposite approach. The last piece, and this is one that I'd say certainly our group gets called quite a bit for, is this idea of navigating the mental health system. I don't know that I have the slide here, but I do have one where I outline all the different kinds of providers that are in the mental health space. So there's psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers and licensed marriage and family therapists and licensed mental health counselors and coaches and licensed alcohol and drug counselors and prescribing nurses, and the list goes on. And for facilities, there's detoxes, rehabs, residential treatment, in outpatient treatment, locked units, whatever the story is. How on earth is anyone to know what the right series of steps is for their loved one that's struggling? So even after we've gotten past this resistance, even after we've put boundaries in place and we finally have somebody that's willing to seek help, how do we know what the right course of treatment is for them? Because the reality is it's going to take a combination of those things in a certain order. There are a number of ways to do it. One certainly is what I mentioned early on, establishing a relationship with some sort of a provider for the family that they know well. Again, a savvy PCP, a psychiatrist, a therapist, whatever it is, that can relate well and connect well with your family, but also who knows the system pretty well. Certainly there's the option to call groups like ours, where this is what we're supposed to do, is put together a care plan. Basically have a team of case managers or a case manager that can sort of understand the field and know, okay, outpatient therapy would be great, or we need substance use monitoring, or 30, 60, 90 residential stays needed first. But often this is another place where families will struggle. Our company, for example, was founded after our founder and CEO, her family spent a considerable amount of money trying to help her brother get into appropriate care. And he really struggled, went through a number of programs that didn't go so well. And she found herself saying, why isn't there a group out there that can sort of guide people through this process and know what is a good treatment center, what isn't, what's sort of good for this person as opposed to just good overall. And so certainly having someone with some level of expertise like that can be really helpful in those situations. Beyond that, there's certainly different kinds of statements that families will make that let you know that they're in a point of resistance. I would say the big picture here is similar to what we talked about before, really being willing to acknowledge that the change is hard, and that if somebody's repeating something over and over, there's something that you're not hearing. So all of these have the specifics that are broken down between having a hard time knowing where to put somebody to, financial issues or whatever the story might be. I would say I tend to get the most success when the first thing I do is agree with somebody, as opposed to start arguing and telling them why it's wrong. So for example, if somebody were to say to me something like, I don't know how to evaluate one facility from another, I might start and say, yeah, it's really hard. I feel like our group, and even with our level of expertise, facility seems great one week, and then they employ new people, or there's a new executive director there the next week, and it's not so great. That's going to be really challenging. I bet we can work around that. I bet we could make some phone calls. I bet there's some research we could do about that. Let's see if we can work around it. Similar to, right, mom still plays tennis and volunteers, her drinking can't be that bad. I hear this one a lot, right? There's certain ways that somebody's still doing okay. Do we really need to have an intervention or something like that? Yeah, that's going to be really confusing. And I also hear you tell me about the times where, she fell asleep in her dinner, and that happens, every Sunday night when you all go out and she's on her second bottle of wine. It's got to be really hard to figure out how to balance those things. What do you think that's about? How can that be? Are you okay with the way things are right now? Would it be okay if she continued playing tennis and having these issues, happen in front of your kids, her grandkids, and sort of the memories they're forming about her? Most people will say no, they're not okay with that. They'd like to see some change. The key part here, again, over and over, is having to connect with that old way of doing things. If there's not an effort, or families don't feel an effort, or individuals don't feel an effort to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and that there's a reason why these things are being walked out the way they are, we're likely never to be heard. And we have to do it in a genuine way. I'd say if we do it in a facetious way, folks know that. They can tell, and they're not likely to listen to what we have to say. Certainly articulating to them and labeling the negatives for them. Yes, this is unknown, it's scary, it's worrisome. There can be people that can be there to walk through it with you and hold your hand every step of the way. You will have to learn new things, that's okay. There are people that can teach you these things. Additionally, and I see this all the time, especially if families haven't done this great preparatory work, they're reaching out to us as their last resort. And so, I talked before about a coalition of the willing. We often get a coalition of the exhausted and the exasperated, where folks have dealt with far too many crisis calls in the middle of the night, far too many worrisome things with bank accounts being drained and not knowing why. And they're coming to us definitely wanting a change, and they just may not have the energy to carry out the boundaries we're going to try and ask them to put in place. That doesn't mean that they're okay with what's going on. Usually they're not. But the work takes on a very different form. That's when we need to try and find these folks support, help them to try and have a life outside of whatever's going on in these crises, and find a way to do a little bit of self-care. And certainly highlighting for folks, again, just how challenging the situations become, and helping them to imagine how much better life could be in the absence of these crises. We've talked a lot about, different ways a professional can help. I don't know that there's anything particularly novel here. The one thing I do want to point out, though, is you'll see I've choicefully taken the word enabled, and I've put a strike through it, or enabling, and put a strike through it, put protecting next to it. I don't use the word enabling with families, and it's for good reason. Nobody that's in a position of enabling, so providing money to someone with a mental health problem that's not seeking help, or providing some money to someone that's abusing substances, they hope it'll go to food, but it ends up going to those substances and furthering the addiction. Those folks don't mean to enable. That's not the point of them giving money at the time. They think they're helping, and usually they think they're protecting. Oftentimes I see it's parents or siblings that think they're protecting their loved one from shame, embarrassment, being broke, death, whatever the story might be. So using the term protecting is often helpful because I'm aligning with the person I'm trying to help change. It's another way of acknowledging that I see where they're coming from and why they have this old way of being. I was talking with a mom today who has an adult son who I'll briefly say she can't figure out why he continues to operate the way he operates. He has been offered everything. He really has a great life available to him if he could only choose to not use substances. And that's the one ask that's being made, and it's a very reasonable ask given his history. And she's very much afraid that if she doesn't provide him with certain resources, that he'll be out on the street and that he'll die and that bad things will happen, despite a long history to suggest otherwise, that he's quite resourceful on the one hand. And on the other, has always come back for help. from family, and has always chosen the resources available to him. So long as I continue to say to mom, or were I to say, you have to stop, you can't, you're enabling him, whatnot, our conversations would never get anywhere. So much of the work is around acknowledging that's really scary, that's terrifying, it's going to be so hard to imagine these things going on. Once I say that, then we can have a conversation about, yeah, when has that happened in the past? Have there been times where he's actually gone out in the street and sort of decided to live in dangerous areas? No, he's actually come back home. Okay, so maybe this isn't as risky as we think it is. Maybe it's not so bad. The other that's so important here is to do the last bullet point there, which is normalizing the situation. A good statistic to carry around in your back pocket, there's a couple of them. One is that 1 in 5 adults in the United States will meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis this year. And over the course of someone's entire life, it's basically a 50-50 shot that they'll meet criteria for a mental health problem. I think it's actually a lot higher than that. I think probably it's more like 70 or 80% of people at some point will meet criteria for a mental health problem. I certainly feel very comfortable sharing with families, not the specifics of other families I've worked with, but I will say very often I've worked with other families that have had this kind of problem. Here's generally how it played out. Here's how it showed up. Here's how we worked through things. Here's where they are now, obviously without disclosing any specifics. Surprisingly powerful for families to know that there are others who have struggled with this kind of issue. And really important to help them understand that, these families are similar to them. There's a lot of bright, talented people in the family. A lot of them are family businesses. They're quite successful. They come from proud traditions of hard work and engagement, philanthropy, whatever the story is. These aren't sort of, families will imagine families that just have problems top to bottom and they're a bunch of jerks or whatever the story is. No, these are great families and they also have issues just like yours.
Wow. That's really great information. Is that the last slide?
I think we're about there. I will say just briefly, most important piece on this slide is this idea of using a crisis as an opportunity. If you do get the phone call that somebody's been arrested, they're in the hospital, they're in an inpatient unit, it's a fantastic time to try and create change. There's leverage to be had. There's people who want to get out of difficult legal situations and out of the hospital. That's a time where conditions can be set and we can say, if you're willing to engage in certain kinds of treatment, that can be available to you if you're willing to go along with plan X or Y. But certainly, I think there is the initial reaction with the crisis to be anxious, fearful, heart rate go up, but it's actually a great moment to try and seize and move forward on. But
Well,
Tom,
John,
I think that makes sense.
great.
I think it's good to wrap there.
That's a great amount of information and well laid out. And I looked through your slides before. I didn't want to interrupt with questions along the way because I knew you had almost everything planning on covering. But from our previous discussion, a couple of questions I had was this notion of what's the pre-presenting problem environment in the family look like, that culture that's so hard to change, that for you, when the presenting problem comes, it's an opportunity to change that culture. But what can families do about, what does that culture look like now, and what can families do about it to change it and start addressing the small items before they become these big items?
It's a great question. I'd say more often than not, it's some version of silence that's problematic early on. Silence and avoidance, they can take a number of forms. I'd say the one that is the trickiest and the most insidious is when families are too nice to each other, which you might not expect. They're not necessarily great at talking about the issues that are showing up, the small slights that are happening one after the other that grow into bigger ones. Those families can really struggle because even as these crises are showing up, they still don't have the skills to express their worries, their concerns, their fears. And it takes a lot of work to help develop that language for them and then to help them use that to figure out how we're going to solve these problems together.
Well, I know that David Brooks in his book, The Second Mountain, talks about in our national culture that people don't feel a sense of place and purpose. He calls it hyper-individualism we're focusing on. He claims that technology has exacerbated the problem, sped it up and made it worse. Do you think technology has caused more of this I'd call it independence within children to the point of estrangement within their family. But do you think technology, cell phones, are part of the problem? And if so, what can families do about that?
I think it certainly plays a role, and a really a critical role. The phenomenon that I notice often is how families interact and whether they interact when folks come home from school, from work, whatever the story is. More often than not, it's people on their phones. They're separated from their family in a lot of ways. There have been a number of studies that are showing that more time on screens can be problematic at a number of different ages. What can be most useful for families is to set boundaries around screens and screen time broadly, whether it's phones, iPads, TVs. A lot of families have decided to have phone-free dinners. And so there's a basket or a bucket that's passed around at the beginning of dinner. Phones go in the basket goes elsewhere, and families have to interact for a period of time. Certainly setting limits on screen time is important too. And doing very similar to what we might do with a toddler sometimes, unfortunately, where we say for bedtime, okay, bedtime's at 8 o'clock, it's 7:30, you have half an hour, 7:45, 15 minutes, 7:50, 5 minutes, and walk our way to it. I was talking about Fortnite before. I think that's a great skill for kids that are playing too much in the way of video games. Have a previously agreed upon boundary, and then remind people as we get closer and closer to that time, so we avoid that eruption that can happen all of a sudden when we say it's time to put down the screen.
Great. Well, I know that in David Brooks' book and in many others, and a lot of the research that I've seen, people that don't have a sense of place or purpose are fragile and less resilient. And having a place of purpose and place creates significant resilience. Most of those studies, when I've read them and all, including David Brooks' work, talk about joining community, but they never focus on family as being that community. And perhaps it's because of all the struggles in the past, it's hard to change that culture. But anyway, I'm glad that you're doing the work you're doing. The last question I have for you, though, is in regard to that change in the culture of the family. When you treat a presenting problem, how do you treat the family simultaneously to treating the individual with the presenting problem?
It's a great question. So often we find families in what we would call an enmeshed state. So as someone struggles in a family, other folks that aren't struggling take on a number of roles. One can become a case manager and try and oversee all their care. Another tends to police things and make sure that they're going to their appointments or that they're not drinking, whatever the story is. One may become the protector or the enabler. Some check out altogether and become silent. And so no one's acting anymore as parent, brother, sister, whatever the story is. They're playing recovery police, case manager, whatever it might be. When we work with families, the first thing we do is try and separate out that enmeshment and say, okay, let's have the person struggling focus primarily on their mental health issues with professionals, because those are the people that should be helping with the mental health problems. And let's coach the family separately around what's happened in the meantime with all these roles you have. What we then get to do is this really nice, beautiful process where we bring people back together slowly over time, and not physically, I'm saying in terms of the way they interact. And what folks can do is that as the person that's struggling gets better, they get to go back to being parents and siblings and talk about hopes and fears and dreams and things that families communicate about, and not, did you drink today? Did you take your antabuse? Did you go to your therapy appointment? So the culture shift is something that has to happen separately at first. We have to untangle this knot, and then we get to put things back together nicely and have some great conversations about what are our values as a family? What are the things that we care most about? How will that define the way we interact with each other? And that part of the work is a lot of fun. That's the thing I look forward to most. That's
great. Well, thank you very much for your time today and for your insight. It was brilliant and very helpful. So I'm going to switch over to just kind of wrapping up then now, but thank you very much for your time. And we'll catch up a little bit later on as well. If you have questions for John, his contact information there is on the slide. And if you have families that need his services and or the O'Connor Group's professional services, either contact me or us at Family Legacy Services or contact John directly. But thank you very much, John. Last thing I'd say for wrapping up is please feel free, you as advisors or families, to tap into the past webinars that we've already put in the library. And finally, the New York State Bar Association, Peter Culver, one of the co-creators of the Family Legacy Council and I went to the New York Bar a number of months ago and asked them if they would be willing to invite some of their members to a family governance conference if we created one. And they said, actually, no, we'd like you to create that conference for our members. So we did. We created a conference for the New York Bar for attorneys to focus on all these issues that John was just presenting in some of the previous webinars. And we actually ran that meeting for them just about 2 weeks ago. And it was extremely well received. Marvin Blum was there speaking on the Family Advancement Sustainability Trust. We had other law firms represented, accounting firms represented, and people focusing on divorce issues as well. So anyway, if you'd like copies of that or like information about that, please feel free to go on the New York State Bar Association website, and you can then take a look at the material there, and you can look at not only the slides, but you can look at the material and the agenda as well, and hear the talks if you're interested. We were going to have Andrea Vaca speak about divorce, negotiated divorce on this call as well, but it just looked like that was too big a topic because she wanted to focus on divorce and also focus on prenuptial agreements as well. So we're going to hold it off for a later date. We do think during summer it's a tough time to have these things, these webinars. So we're going to hold off on scheduling the next one until sometime in the fall, but we will keep you posted. In the meantime, thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. Let others know if you'd like about the process. We are recording it, so if you know others that would like to hear it, they can go on the Family Legacy Council website and they can sign up and listen to the recording as well. So again, thank you, John, for today. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and we will sign off until next time.